Welcome everyone to another episode of the Terrain Studio. I'm your host, Sean Morris. Today on the Terrain Studio Patreon tutorial, we're going to get back to working on the Kashyyyk project. For this tutorial, we're going to be working on the roof sections. This particular roof section, we're going to do a nice overspray of sand brown on top of our primer coat that we've already added. Once we've done it to this piece, I'm actually going to be sliding over into the other roof section, which you have seen, and that's on the hut itself. So we're actually going to focus the majority of the work on this piece. Again, using the sand brown color, this has already been base coated here, but I did want to kind of show you the application process. We're going to be skipping back and forth between the pieces just to give you all the steps. They are going to be done sort of in sections, as we are going to be working with a number of paints that take a number of hours to dry. But for purposes of this, again, we want to get back to this. We're going to finish up the sides. We're going to add some rooftop elements in terms of some moss effects. We're going to be doing a number of things to this, tying it into the overall project. So let's jump in the airbrush booth, get at this, and have a look at the next step. So we just jumped over into the airbrush booth here, getting ready to put down our base color here of the sand brown. We're just going to thin this out a little bit with the airbrush thinner, as well as adding a few drops of flow improver into the chamber. So this just keeps the mixture nice and fluid, allows us to get a nice even overspray here. I just got the roof on the Lazy Susan here, just use that to spin it around, just manipulate the object a lot less, and just allows me to get a nice even flow and go back and forth with ease. So I'm just going to go ahead and start laying down the base coat here. I will speed up the video considerably, but we're going to give it a pretty thorough coat, but we're not overly concerned if we get into every recess and crevice. We're going to be adding a number of inks and enamels to this project, and so they will really fill in any of the gaps or recesses that we miss. So go ahead and just give it a general overbrush here. Again, we're going to put it onto this roof, and then you're going to see me advance and bring in the other hut, which has already been coated here, but just for purposes, I wanted to show you this is going to be a process that's going to be repeated over any roof surfaces within the project. So let's just speed this up, enjoy the music, and I'll see you in the next step. So we've transitioned now back to the table, and we're going to move on to working on the hut roof. We have just set aside the small hut roof here. It's still drying. You see the color's pretty close, although it's a bit damp, and so it's a bit darker. So we'll let that lighten up, and we'll set that aside. For the roof section here, what we're going to do is move on to a little bit of a technique, not something I'm fond of, but dry brushing. For this, we're going to be using Vallejo Wood Model Air color. I really like this color. It really actually contrasts super nice with the previous color used. And we're going to pop this up using, like I said, a little bit of a dry brush. We're going to concentrate for this on the ridges. So this corrugated paper that we used to make the hut really has a natural undulation to it. So finding and picking up the high points is quite easy. You don't even have to be that accurate with the dry brush, just simply how the papers works. You have a natural high point. What you are going to want to do though in this particular case is you're going to want to focus your directional brushing with the actual ridges. So you'll notice that on my design, I've cut in a V shape here with the paper. And so for each of the sections, what I want to do is just concentrate on that particular directional flow. I want to make sure that I'm staying within the sort of defined lines, particularly when I get to the top section, as there is several changes in direction. So you'll see as I speed up the video here that really all I'm doing is using this unidirectional flow in terms of the brush strokes, following the lines and really staying on the high point. The amount of dry brush that you do here is really dependent on how much of a highlight you're going for. When we get to the final stages, you'll see that we've significantly knocked this color down. However, this is going to add sort of our highlight, our high point on the ridge. And despite all the layers that we put on subsequently, this top point will remain the brightest. And so think about that going forward. How muted, how bright do you want your final look? And use that as your adjustment for how many layers of dry brushing that you do. So again, let's enjoy some music. Let's go through the flow, and I'll pick you guys up in the next step. For the next stage, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding an ink layer. For this, we're going to be using transparent raw sienna ink by Liquitex. This ink is really cool, but I've actually diluted it a little bit, so please note the frothiness in here is just because I have simply added some thinner to this. For this project, I'm going to be using an Ammo by MIG saw brush here, and this is a streaking brush, and the brush itself is specialized in the sense that it has already troughs cut within the bristles. This is particularly of interest because it's going to actually displace the ink out of the wells over the ridges and then back into the adjacent wells. So I'm going to be kind of using this brush to move and manipulate where the ink is actually going to pool and trough. There is going to be a natural tendency based on gravity to have some of the ink sort of pool around the lower lip. That's perfectly fine in this. It's just going to build up a little bit of a darker recess there. So you can certainly monitor the amount and the pooling with your brush. You just have to simply keep picking it up and moving it around. For this, again, just like the dry brush, I want to make sure that I'm concentrating in sections. I don't want to be flowing too much over any of the adjacent panels. So panel by panel, you'll see that I work through this, again, rotating this around and moving it, working from a kind of a top to bottom fashion just based on the natural flow of the ink itself. So if you want a bit of a darker look, although I don't think that's going to be necessary based on future steps, you could certainly do not have to dilute this. However, I chose to do that just based on the fact that I knew I was going to be adding some darker layers. You can see here I'm just kind of working around the top, and I'll sort of work around in this cyclical fashion as I complete this top section. I'm only going to do the top portion, and then you'll come back and you'll see what the whole finished thing looks like. I decided here to be expedited and use my lazy Susan just to help me out. So let's enjoy the process and catch you guys in the next step. So we're now ready to reapply another layer to the large hut. You can see here that the lower portion of the hut has actually been given the entire next treatment. We're going to, however, concentrate on the upper portion this time. For this, we're going to be using the AK Interactive Rust Streaks, same brush as before, and we're going to apply this into the recesses, concentrating on the troughs to get a nice dark variety to the lines. Just looking here at the three portions, you can see where we've transitioned from the initial airbrush to then the ink layers to now the subsequent rust streaks. We do have a bit further to go, but I did want to show that in comparison. So to start this off, what we're going to do is a little bit of a pre-treat. And for this, we're going to be using an enamel wash by AK Interactive called Light Rust. Just to contrast this is an enamel wash, not like the Vallejo acrylic washes, just keeping that very clear. So that means that it is going to have a little bit more of an extensive drying time, and it will require a little bit of a different treatment method when it comes to the next layers. After we put the light rust on, we're going to transition immediately to the rust streaks, and we're going to be doing that in a wet effect. So we're not going to allow drying in between. Decant a little bit of the rust streaks. Again, the amount you use is up to you. You'll see that I don't use a lot here, and I'm just applying it with a sponge as a little bit of a pre-treat. So I'm just going to go ahead and sort of just sporadically soak in some of the rust streaks into the existing. Some of it's pooling, some of it's going to be a bit more thinned. However you want to apply it is completely up to you. It is going to add a little color variation, as you can see in the lower portion of the hut. Next, we're going to decant a little bit of the rust streaks, maybe a little bit more than we did of the light rust, because this is going to be applied more in a traditional wash fashion. We are going to be soaking the entire surface of the hut with this application. Just cleaning up the bottle here a little bit, gotta avoid those spills. Using the same brush that we did before, the Ammo by MIG saw brush, we are going to then apply the the streaking rust here at working from the top and pulling it down. I'm going to be doing this in a little bit of a different fashion as before. I'm going to be working on about 3 panels at a time. Because I'm then going to need to go back with my brush and restipple. In this case, I'm actually pulling off the material because again, I want to create a little bit of variation, not only with the light rust, but also with the rust streaks. And by pulling or saturating back some of that up, it's going to allow me to create some of that. Primarily, the brush or the sponge rather will pull it from the high sides, which is rather important because we do want to leave the dark recessed troughs here, and that's quite important. As you can see in the lower bowl portion, there's some significantly concentrated portions. So I'm going to let the work show the results, and we'll come back in the next application where we'll actually start applying some of the weathering effects and get this looking a little bit more like it has been in the trees for a few years. So I've brought you under a little bit more of a close camera so that I can show you this next application. During this step here, we're going to be using the AK Interactive Slime Green. It's the dark enamel color, and we're going to be applying it to sort of add that elemental feel to the piece. I've already gone ahead and done the upper portion here, and you can see that it gives this sort of patina-like finish. The process here isn't very complex, but it is going to tie into the next steps. And you can see here what we're ultimately going to end up with is a moss finish. While that's not going to be specifically housed within this tutorial, I'm going to do an entire separate one to show you how to make that and how to apply it in different fashions. For this, though, I am going to work on a small section and show you how to apply this particular product. Here, I'm just using a cheap brush. I am going to be flattening it out, so you don't want to use anything expensive or one of your favorite brushes here. But the application process is pretty straightforward. We're going to decant a little bit of the dark slime green, and we're just going to apply it in small, erratic patterns. You can make large portions, just little stipples here and there. You can tie two together. You can have them in close configuration or widespread. Completely up to you, artist preference here. However, what you do want to do is you want to have some variations in the density of the slime green. So you'll see in some portions, I'm going to apply it a little bit thicker. In other sections, I'm going to feather it out. This is quite important because we want to create this sort of almost like a camouflage-like pattern. You can have it in the upper portions, lower portions, as you see fit. We are going to be diluting this substantially, as you can see in the upper portion. It's definitely does not have the concentration that we're initially laying this down with, and I'll show you how to do that when we come back. So we're going to jump straight into using the white spirits here on the next step. So this is for enamel products. The white spirits is going to be decanted, and it's going to be using to rehydrate and allow us to start dispersing and moving around the previously applied slime green enamel product. For this, I'm initially going to start off by using the saw brush that you saw previously. However, I will at some point transition over to just a sort of more all-purpose craft brush, something that has a little bit more of a stiff bristle and something that I can actually start to move the slime green around a little bit more. You'll notice though I am going in with a more of a precise application here, re-saturating, rehydrating, if you will, that previously laid layer. I do want to concentrate using the saw brush here on pulling it off the upper portions of the ridges. Again, we want to leave a lot off of that. That initial highlight that we laid in step one, that really wants to be preserved throughout this process. So I am going in here, moving around what I can. This did dry overnight, so it is quite dry. If you leave it a few less hours, you can probably end up doing it with a bit more of a soft bristle, but it's not going to hurt to let it dry to make sure that it is in fact good and dry before you start moving it around. When I shift over to the brush, I'm almost going to be using sort of a scrape type fashion and really sort of go in there and move it around. You can see that I don't want to move my nice brush here back and forth because it's really going to destroy the bristles. So that's the reason that I sort of chose to move over to the other brush. You could certainly do that if you wanted to. You'll also notice that the initial dispersion of the green slime is nowhere near the softer finish that's in the upper bowl. That I assure you is just achieved by persistence, by constant moving around. You do want to soak up the white spirits if you don't want it to drip over the edge. So you'll notice that I kind of keep picking that back up with my brush. You can certainly sop it up with a paper towel, or if you're using a larger bristle brush, it will pick it up with a bit more regularity than this one. It's kind of a soft brush with not a lot of capacity to hold any white spirits. So I'm going to go ahead and shift over to that, and you're going to see that I'm going to work my way around systematically, really diluting out those patches until I get a much more dispersed feel. This is again artist preference as you see fit, as you figure out what amount of dispersion, how concentrated you want your final look to be. That's completely up to you. So let's let the tape run, and we'll see what the final product looks like. So we're now set for the final application of product. For this stage, what we're going to be using is some Citadel paint, a contrast yellow. This paint plays particularly well with both the browns and the greens that we've already applied. The focus, as always, is going to be restoring that really rich, dark nature of the grooves, as well as playing with some of the highlights that we've already added. You can see here the diluted green is now nice and muted, but it definitely needs to be brought back up and the richness restored. The contrast paint actually does this job in one magic step. So I'm not really keen on product application in terms of relying on it to be the sole provider of the realistic effect. However, this does a really good job at restoring a lot of what we've already put on, as well as highlighting some of those earlier layers. So you're going to see how quick and easy this is, and you'll see in the end result what I kind of mean about this. So just going under the rim here, we're just going to start to apply it. There's going to be a little bit of magic applied in this step because it does take a little bit of time to get it all down, and really it's a redundant process. But you'll see what I'm doing here as I'm just pulling this contrast paint down through, allowing gravity to default a little bit of the density. Although I do want to, in the end, you'll see that I go back and sort of hand manipulate some of this patches that I don't really like, or where it actually prematurely stops midway down and creates a little bit of a drip effect. We want to avoid drips. We want to have natural flow and density applied via the material. We don't want to have like unsightly drips or any sort of blockage of the streak effect. So if it's flowing nicely, that's fine, but you may have to go back and manipulate a little bit of that, and I'll show you what I mean here in one moment. So you can see here now that we've finished up the application, and you can see a couple drips there just in the right portion. So I'm going to go ahead and clean those up. And what I mean by cleaning those up is, I mean, just streak them down a little bit more. You don't have to remove this. We're certainly not going in and stippling out anything with a sponge or anything like that. We want to keep that streak effect, and you can see there's a natural density and variation in that. You'll also see that we have a really super rich color, both the dried portion on the upper portion as well as the wet lower portion are pretty close in color, which tells you that this is going to dry about how you put it on. So when you're looking at manipulating color density, just put it down how you want it to dry. The end effect will be pretty well achieved, and it should be pretty true to the nature of what you've applied it down. Sometimes you get that trick by products where they dry a lot lighter than you intended or darker. However, this application, if you follow this process, the results that you get on screen here should be something that you can easily replicate. We are going to be, of course, adding some more elemental type feels with both the moss as well as some pigment powders, just to again add a little bit of realistic elements, build that mossy look up as well. You can see how stark and green this moss is. I assure you the effect will be quite nice, and the undertones that you've worked really hard to lay in via the slime green and any subsequent flocking that you put on are only going to play together. It's going to look really fun. I'm excited about that. We got a little bit of cleaning up to do in terms of painting with the brass rims, adding a few chimneys and a few other effects, but otherwise we're going to call this finished. Thanks everyone for watching another episode of the Terrain Studio. Patrons, thank you very much for your monthly contributions. Without your support, none of this would have been possible. A special thanks also to the supporters of the studio. Your contributions in kind make the content, product, and overall viewer quality much more enjoyable. So special thank you to you as well. See you guys in the next video. Cheers.